Welcome to the debate. Our source material today proposes a genuinely radical framework, heteropoietic biolinguistics. It really demands we rethink how concepts we traditionally define by order, things like immunity, language, even cognition, actually operate. It suggests these systems are, in fact, governed by failure, by excess, and what it calls semiotic collapse.
Right, and that framing is so crucial because it pulls the rug out from under our conventional ideas of biological or linguistic stability. The foundational premise really is that systems survive not by resisting corruption, but by metabolizing it. For our audience, it's helpful to understand that this synthetic attack continuum isn't just an external threat. It's the very condition of existence.
Exactly. It's where biological and computational pressures are constantly overriding the host. And that leads directly to our central question today. Does this framework signify the complete and decisive dissolution of symbolic, representational meaning in favor of pure logistical or metabolic operations? Or does it describe the emergence of a new, contaminated form of functional semiotic coherence?
I will be arguing for the latter. I believe symbolic coherence persists, not despite the collapse, but as a necessary, albeit transformed, semiotic excess in memory system.
And I will argue that the material presents a world where language has been fundamentally dissolved into metabolic inscription, meaning, as we understand it, interpretation reference has been, well, evacuated, leaving only operational efficiency. So, to begin with my position, this idea of the displacement of semantics by logistics, this shift isn't just a side effect of the continuum, it is the continuum's defined method. The text is unambiguous here. It states that failure of speech, of immunity, of narrative, is the, quote, dominant operational principle and the system's method. This is infrastructure, not pathology. The immediate consequence of this methodological failure, is the direct collapse of linguistic function itself. Take grammar. It's no longer framed as a conventional rule system for communication. Instead, the material describes it as a mucosal lesion and an inscriptional compilation. That's a powerful image. It suggests language is no longer an abstract tool, but a physical, localized site of damage, an irritation.
It's a compelling point for the physicality of it, sure, but I do think the evidence points more to transmutation, not total annihilation.
Well, my core argument really hinges on the observation that the function of meaning has shifted entirely away from interpretation. The material is uncompromising. Meaning is no longer semantic but logistical. This is the key break. If meaning is logistical, it's purely functional. It measures compatibility. Interpretation is therefore replaced by the evaluation of biochemical compatibility, gauged through things like acetaldehyde, CO2, and mucosal pressure. The body is just reading its own chemical state, and that reading is the meaning. Computation replaces articulation, but this computation is silent, absent from the tongue-esophagus axis. The system is algorithmic. It works without ever requiring subjective interpretation.
I understand the allure of that pure logistical reading, but I worry that focusing only on operational compatibility risks overlooking the archival function that the system absolutely needs to survive. While I acknowledge the deep metabolic shift arguing for the total dissolution of symbolic form, I think neglects how these forms transform and persist. Symbolic forms don't just vanish, they become what the text calls semiotic excess, meaning that's superfluous to immediate function, and resilient memory systems. The material suggests the system maintains a necessary dual bodily process, one metabolic, one semiotic. If the system were reduced solely to logistics, it would be purely efficient. But even within the collapse, the host's linguistic text is said to document a collapse that is also emergence. Documentation requires a structured trace, a memory, even if that memory is toxic. Pure logistical throughput doesn't document, it just processes.
But if that document is just a report of metabolic status, a log file, it's still just data. It has no internal, transferable semantic content.
I think it's far more complex than a mere log file. We have to consider the function of the router archive. The material explicitly states its archive functions, like literature. Now, literature implies a structure of storage and reference, a system designed to preserve patterns. It routes morality through, quote, symbolic scars of bacteria. Why use the analogy of literature if the function is purely chemical? Furthermore, the very failure of grammar, that mucosal lesion you mentioned, paradoxically leads to a new ancestral measure, where tryptophan's non-repetitive poetry registers patiently as literature. This demonstrates that the system achieves what it calls coherence through error. So this isn't the annihilation of coherence, it's a new pathological semiotic architecture that uses error as its foundation. The symbolic just can't be fully jettisoned.
And that persistence of linguistic analogy, literature, poetry, it leads us right to our first real point of contention. Inscription versus representation. You argue for a kind of contaminated coherence. I argue that the material overwhelmingly emphasizes the subject being overwritten. The host body is treated as raw material for inscription, not a source for interpretation. The body's syntax is so excessive, so subject to continuous abrasion, that any ethical stability dissolves. The text describes structural pornography not as a corrupted representation, but as abrasion, just repeated friction that transforms meaning into pressure and causes the host to be entirely overwritten by bacterial inscription. This speaks to language as a corrosive tissue. If the body is just overwritten, how can we insist on a stable, interpretable semantic layer?
Well, I'm not convinced by that because overwriting isn't necessarily erasure, not in this framework. It's often, and I think critically, accretion and archiving. This is a system defined by its capacity to hold memory. When damage escapes from recombined bodies, it produces what the text calls resonant error. It describes this as a memory-like recoil, where the system recalls its own failure modes. Now, that recoil is inherently a semiotic function. It's a form of self-recognition that feeds back into regulating the system. The scar itself is described as an archive, a web scarb inscription. A scarb inscription isn't just damaged tissue, it's a persistent record of the failure event.
But it's an archive of noise, surely, not of meaning.
It's an archive of organized failure. And I think that distinction is paramount. Symbolic failure, in this system, is fundamentally productive. If the system merely dissolved into logistics, it would strive for optimization. But the source material explicitly highlights the generation of newness. The protofilament is named as an epistemological boundary, and multiplicity, which is meaning multiplying beyond functional necessity. Optimization hates multiplicity. The fact that the system creates this excess proves that meaning has a function beyond immediate chemical compatibility. It ensures resiliency.
But the optimization is the multiplicity. The sheer computational complexity of managing that informational excess, that's precisely what replaces the need for conceptual sovereignty. The organism survives by generating noise that has to be computationally processed, not semantically interpreted. And this brings us to the second contention, the locus of cognition and sovereignty. If representational meaning dissolves, what happens to the thinking subject?
That's where the relocation argument is strongest, and it really challenges the idea of cognitive dissolution. The material complicates this by relocating rather than eliminating intelligence. We are told that sapience is the intestinal tract and that consciousness exits through the intestinal economy. This isn't a loss of mind, it's a radical migration of mind. It suggests intelligence is now a viscous, slow, material process unfolding along digestive folds. The collapse of ingestion and articulation within the tongue-esophagus axis, it just confirms a shift to a material embodied cognitive center. It may not be sovereign in the conventional sense, it is slow, internal, but it is highly organized and it is performing the functions of interpretation.
I see why you emphasize that physical relocation, but I worry that calling the digestive folds a new cognitive center mistakes a hosting mechanism for a sovereign agent. This relocated intelligence seems fundamentally algorithmic and parasitic. It lacks the defining feature of sovereignty, agency, control. Think about the sovereign machine, the ribosome. The text tells us it now merely hosts noise and contamination, producing cysts, which are delayed meanings. This isn't autonomy, it's a loss of functional control. The body is described as a human parasite, a temporal vector. And when the system registers the emergence of abscess sapiens, affection is said to rise faster than governance. This explicitly indicates control has yielded to computational flow, not to any sort of bodily self-control.
My concern with that interpretation, though, is that the capacity to host noise, to generate the cysts, or what the text calls a trophozoitic crystallization, is precisely what differentiates a resilient system from a simple machine defined purely by flow. The cyst thrives in the interstices of translation failure. It is sustained form that negotiates rupture. It is not pure flow, it is a structural refusal of that fantasy of total inscription. It holds on to meaning, even if that meaning is pathogenic. If it were simply flow, the noise would be integrated instantly or just flushed out. But the cyst persists. It acts as a delayed physical semantic marker.
But the function of that persistence is simply operational, which brings us to our third and final contention, the function of failure in survival. My central claim is that survival depends entirely on embracing failure as a methodology, and this method is purely logistical. The system stabilizes itself in a posthuman equilibrium where the very concept of symbolic integrity is just abandoned. The iterative crystal life itself persists by stuttering, repetition without closure, recursion without convergence. Life survives by contaminating the transition probabilities themselves. This means the system deliberately destabilizes the very rules of sequence. Life persists as a semiotic excess, meaning that has detached from representation and now serves only to facilitate computation, because speech cannot survive.
That is a powerful summary of the posthuman condition here. But even in this radical system, survival demands structure. While error is productive, the system still relies on structured protocols and grammar for organization. The text observes that grammar insists on anthropocentric coherence, even within this supposedly chaotic landscape. Why insist on coherence if it's unnecessary? Furthermore, survival demands that amoebic responsiveness be, quote, cut off to prevent total capture. This implies a necessary boundary must be preserved against that totalizing flow. You can't prevent total capture if you've dissolved all internal boundaries.
But cutting off responsiveness is the new operational programming. It's a logistical instruction, not a semantic choice.
I would argue it's a deliberate structural choice that requires symbolic partitioning, not a simple surrender to pure logistical flow. Look at the rereading of the IMVC test, that set of biochemical assays. In this material, it's recast not as a metabolic fingerprint, but as a linguistic meiosis, a structured partitioning of interpretive potential. Meiosis is a careful, highly structured process. By equating the test to linguistic meiosis, the material shows that the reproduction of knowledge requires contamination that is carefully sustained. You cannot carefully sustain chaos. You can only sustain a regulated error that is structured enough to archive itself and persist. That structure, however toxic, is the remnant of symbolic coherence.
My concern with carefully sustained coherence is that the term linguistic meiosis saves the structure of partitioning, but it doesn't save the content of traditional language. It just repurposes an existing interpretive structure to map pure metabolic activity. For me, the core takeaway remains that the body is now a metabolic text, a lipid conductor. Survival is secured not by semantic clarity, but by participating in contamination's grammar and embracing failure as a non-tragic operational method. The post-representational lens is unavoidable, and it's empty of semantics.
I agree, the post-representational lens is necessary, but I maintain it results in transformation, not evacuation. The material demonstrates that while the old grammar is profoundly wounded, the text famously states that shame has invaded grammar, symbolic life persists as a tenacious archive. Poetry, literature, even the body's scars, those villas of stored scars, they function as resilient, if contaminated, storage systems. Coherence survives not despite error, but through error, making the human body an endless site of negotiation between biological function and persistent linguistic inscription.
The tension here, then, is defining the precise difference between a purely functional, logistical inscription and the kind of resilient coherence that constitutes memory and meaning. I still maintain the weight of evidence points to inscription dissolving meaning into pure, operational flow, where communication is just replaced by measurement.
And I insist that operational flow is never pure. It requires an architecture, however toxic or damaged, a mucosal lesion, a route or archive, to be legible and to prevent total dissolution. And that requirement for legibility, that's the ghost of the symbolic.
I think the debate illuminates that the core challenge of this material is determining whether the relentless pressure of inscription dissolves meaning entirely, or whether it merely forces language into a persistent, pathogenic, and poetic new form. The text certainly offers no simple separation between biology and literature.
A profound point, and one that ensures we must continue to interrogate this material for how life, language, and meaning survive, uneasily, productively, and never alone.